Story 1. A year ago, when I was 23, I was living with my parents. I had my own car, and they trusted me enough to give me a lot of freedom. My room was located in the basement of our house, which had its own entrance, allowing me to come and go without disturbing anyone. It almost felt like I had my own little apartment. One day, I received a Snapchat from an old friend named Denise. We hadn't spoken in years, and I was surprised to see her name pop up on my phone. We used to be very close back in high school, sharing laughs and secrets. But after she moved away for college, our friendship faded. Seeing her message brought a rush of nostalgia. I couldn't help but wonder what had brought her back into my life after all this time. As we began messaging back and forth, I felt a sense of excitement. Denise shared that she had recently moved back to town and was trying to reconnect with old friends. It felt good to catch up, reminiscing about our high school days, our favorite classes, and the silly things we used to do together. It was like no time had passed at all. After a few days of chatting, Denise suggested we hang out. She texted me one night around 10 p.m., asking if I wanted to come over. I was taken aback. It seemed a bit sudden, especially so late at night. Yet, the prospect of seeing her after so long made my heart race. I hadn't seen her in years, and part of me felt that I should seize this opportunity. I looked at the clock and realized I didn't have anything planned for the next day. The curiosity of reconnecting in person outweighed my reservations, so I agreed. She quickly sent me her address, and it was only a short drive away. I went upstairs to check if my parents were still awake, hoping to let them know I was going out. But they had already gone to bed, so I decided not to wake them and quietly slipped out of the house, excitement coursing through me. I hopped into my car and typed Denise's address into my GPS. As I drove, I felt a mix of nostalgia and anxiety. I could hear my phone buzzing with notifications, but I didn't check it. I focused on the road, mentally preparing for our reunion. When I finally pulled up to her house, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The street was eerily dark and quiet, far more so than I had expected for a neighborhood close to downtown. The lack of streetlights made it hard to see, and the house itself looked run down, like it hadn't seen a lick of maintenance in years. The surrounding houses had a similar neglectful appearance, but Denise's place stood out as the worst. It was small and seemed to be falling apart. I sat in my car for a moment, contemplating whether I should just turn around and leave. This didn't seem like the kind of place I would imagine Denise living in. As I sat there, I felt a wave of doubt creeping in. Was this really the right address? Just as I was about to text her to double check, I opened my phone and saw a new Snapchat message from her. It read, "Come inside." That message sent chills down my spine. I felt an instinctive twinge of fear. Why would she ask me to come in like that? Especially since I hadn't seen her in so long. I tried to shake off my unease, convincing myself that maybe I was just being paranoid. I got out of my car and approached the front door, but as I did, I hesitated. Before knocking, I pressed my ear against the door, hoping to hear familiar voices or laughter. Instead, I heard a man's voice inside, speaking to someone in a low, muffled tone. My heart raced. This didn't feel right at all. I took a step back, unsure of what to do. My phone buzzed again with another Snapchat from Denise, but I didn't even look at it. The tension in the air made my skin crawl. I quickly backed away from the door and dialed 911, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. I told the dispatcher my location and explained that I thought something sketchy was happening at the house. They assured me that they would send someone out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. I decided to return to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked down the walkway, I glanced back at the house, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, and my breath caught in my throat. A large man wearing a white t-shirt and shorts stood in the doorway, staring at me with a blank expression. My instinct was to run, but I held my ground, unsure of what he might do. The police arrived shortly after I called. Their sirens cut through the quiet of the night, and I felt a sense of relief as they pulled up. The man continued to stand there, watching me as the officers got out of their cars. One officer approached him while another came over to me. I explained everything. The Snapchats from Denise, my decision to come over, and the man's presence in the doorway. The officer listened intently and asked me if I knew the people living in the house. I explained that I had only known Denise in high school and didn't recognize the man. The man denied knowing anything about a Denise Snapchat account and claimed he didn't even know who she was. The police seemed frustrated but explained that they couldn't check their phones without a warrant. There wasn't enough evidence to get one, so they informed me that there was little they could do. After some back and forth, the police told me to head home. I felt a mix of disappointment and lingering fear as they drove away, leaving me with a sense of unresolved tension. I made it back home safely, but the night felt heavy on my shoulders. I sat in my room, replaying everything that had just happened. Once I settled down, I tried messaging Denise again on Snapchat, hoping to get some clarity, but my messages went unanswered, leaving me feeling more unsettled. Why hadn't she replied? Did she even know I was there? The next day, I reached out to another friend of mine who had been closer with Denise. I needed to find out more about her and see if she could help me figure out what had just transpired. After some digging, I managed to get her new email address and sent her a detailed account of everything that had happened. I waited anxiously for a response, my mind racing with possibilities. When I finally received her email, my heart sank as I read through it. She confirmed my worst fears. Denise had never reached out to me on Snapchat. The account I had been communicating with was definitely an imposter. A wave of disbelief washed over me. Who had I been talking to? What were their intentions? It sent chills down my spine to realize I had almost walked into a potentially dangerous situation. It was a stark reminder of how easily one can be deceived in today's digital world. I felt a mix of relief that I hadn't gone inside, but also frustration for being fooled. That night marked a turning point for me, teaching me to be more cautious about who I trusted online. I made a vow to myself to verify identities in the future, especially when it came to old friends who suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Story 2. After beginning my last year of graduate school, I moved into a house shared with several other students. The house sat directly on a busy road, and a narrow sidewalk ran right in front of it. The living room window was just a few feet away from this sidewalk, which meant we often saw people passing by. For privacy, we usually kept the curtains drawn, creating a quiet, closed-off atmosphere. I hadn't known any of my roommates prior to moving in. They were strangers to me, and since they were always away studying or with their own friends, we rarely saw each other. I'd moved to the city specifically for school, so I didn't have many connections. It didn't help that I had recently ended a 4-year relationship, leaving me feeling emotionally drained and isolated. Unsure of what to do next, and with few people to talk to, I was left with plenty of time alone. Eventually, to fill that empty space and maybe meet someone new, I downloaded a few dating apps in October. Initially, I didn't invest much time in it, focusing more on my studies, but eventually, it became a bit of a pastime. As the school year progressed and my schedule relaxed, I found myself spending more time on the dating apps. One day on Bumble, I matched with a girl named Lainey. She was 21, several years younger than my 25. Her profile stood out immediately, mostly because her photos had a highly polished, almost professional quality that seemed uncommon. There was something a bit too perfect about her look that made me wonder if her profile was real. We started chatting, and despite my initial skepticism, I found her easy to talk to, and she seemed interested in me too. Our conversations progressed quickly from casual topics to flirtation. I still had doubts, but after she sent me a more casual selfie, it helped me believe she was genuine. After a few days of friendly, lighthearted chats, things started to progress, and she gave me her Snapchat. This didn't seem strange to me. I'd exchanged social media accounts with strangers before. Everything felt like it was going at a comfortable pace. As we continued to talk, I began thinking about the possibility of meeting up in person. Before making any moves, I decided to show Lainey's profile to my friend Devin, the only person I felt close to in this city. Devin's reaction was immediate. He felt something was off. He pointed out that her model-like photos seemed a bit too polished and mentioned the possibility that she might be a catfish. Devin even noted that her selfie looked somewhat different from the profile pictures. His comments stayed with me and made me look at her profile with fresh eyes. My excitement dampened, and I started second-guessing everything. Despite this, part of me still wanted to believe she was real, so I continued chatting with her. But each time I tried to arrange an in-person meetup, Lainey made excuses, and my unease grew. Just to be cautious, I disabled my location on Snapchat, though I worried it might already be too late and that she could have already seen my location through past snaps. Curiosity kept me chatting with Lainey, even though my doubts were growing. Soon, however, her messages started to take a strange turn. They became overly sexual in a way that felt forced, as if she was trying to provoke or embarrass me. Her comments were increasingly bizarre, and her flirtation felt out of sync with the friendly tone we'd had before. At one point, Lainey even asked me for intimate pictures, which set off even more red flags. I felt uncomfortable, but also hesitant to sever ties because I still didn't know if she was truly just an awkward person or if something more disturbing was going on. I asked her once again if she wanted to meet up in person, but as before, she dodged the question, making some vague excuse. Finally, after more persistence, Lainey agreed to a video call. The lighting on her end, however, was so poor that I could hardly make out her face. This seemed strange considering how well lit her other photos had been, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence. Yet soon after, her messages took on an even darker tone. She casually mentioned that she was near my house, which caught me off guard. Lainey had never outright stated that she knew my location, but her comment made me suspicious that she had been tracking me. It was unsettling, and I began to feel a genuine sense of dread. That was the tipping point. I decided I'd had enough. I blocked her on all platforms and called Devon, explaining the whole unsettling series of events. He offered to come over for the night, and I gladly accepted, knowing I'd feel safer with someone there. My roommates were all out, and I was starting to feel extremely vulnerable in the house. Later that night, with Devon by my side, I started to feel more at ease. But as we sat in the living room, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A man in his 40s was standing outside, directly in front of the living room window, staring in. He was clean cut but looked greasy, with a comb over and glasses. This wasn't Laney, but something about his stare made my skin crawl. Devon noticed him too, and we both knew this was far from normal. He suggested calling the police, and I agreed. But before we could make the call, the man began pounding on the window. Each strike against the glass was loud and forceful, and I genuinely thought it might break. The man stayed silent, continuing to pound on the window and stare at us as if waiting for us to come outside. Devon and I retreated to another room, but we could still hear the relentless pounding on the window. Devon called the police, who assured us they'd be there in under 5 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. Then, with a terrifying crash, the window shattered. My heart raced as we heard the sound of glass breaking, followed by the man's eerie laughter. It became clear that he was entering the house. Devon and I rushed to the back door and managed to slip out just as the police arrived. Standing on the street, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief seeing the officers enter. They managed to arrest the man, who was still inside, his laughter echoing in my head long after he was taken away. In the aftermath, I shared everything with the police, including the unsettling conversations with Lainey and her apparent knowledge of my location. A few weeks later, investigators revealed that Lainey's account was linked to the man who had broken in. This realization was haunting, making me realize just how close I'd come to serious harm. Even after this, I received a few more disturbing messages from random accounts, which I promptly reported to the police. The experience shook me deeply, but I was able to focus on my studies, graduate, and move to a new place far away from that house. I never saw that man again, but sometimes I think back to that night and wonder what would have happened if Devon hadn't been there. Story 3. 5 years ago, I was turning 15. An age that felt significant for a lot of reasons, but mainly because I had been eagerly anticipating my first cell phone. For months, I begged my parents to get me one, highlighting how all my friends had already joined the smartphone world. I felt left out, like I was missing out on so many experiences. When I finally unwrapped that shiny new phone on my birthday, I felt a rush of excitement and freedom. It was a big deal to me, not just for the phone itself, but because it symbolized a step into independence. After setting it up, I started to explore all the apps I could download. Among them, Snapchat caught my eye. Although I wasn't particularly interested in social media, I recognized that Snapchat was incredibly popular at the time. Everyone was using it, and it was the perfect way to connect with my friends. Once I got Snapchat up and running, I added my close friends from school. I was cautious, not wanting to add anyone I didn't know well. It felt safer that way. A week passed, and I was still adjusting to having my phone when I received a notification. Someone named Jay had added me. I didn't recognize the name at all, but I thought, what's the harm in adding him back? The profile picture looked like a typical guy my age, so I figured he might be a fellow student I simply hadn't met yet. With a naive optimism, I accepted the request, thinking it would be cool to make a new friend. For the first few days after that, Jay and I exchanged a few casual Snapchats. They were nothing too unusual, just friendly greetings and what's up messages. I replied politely, but I didn't feel compelled to dive deeper into a conversation. As time went on, I began to notice something odd. Jay's location on the Snap map frequently popped up near places I often visited, like my school and the local mall where I sometimes went with my family. I thought it was interesting, but not alarming. After all, it was entirely possible he was a student at my school. I brushed it off as coincidence. However, the more I saw his Bitmoji near my usual haunts, the more it intrigued me. It felt like he was just hanging out where I was. But again, it wasn't strange enough to make me feel uncomfortable. It was simply a curious detail I kept in the back of my mind. One Saturday afternoon, I was hanging out at my friend Dylan's house, along with a couple of other friends. We spent the day playing video games and talking about everything under the sun. At one point, I opened Snapchat to check my messages and was startled to see Jay's location pop up once more. This time, it was near Dylan's neighborhood. My curiosity piqued. I showed the snap map to Dylan and the others, joking about how weird it was that this random guy kept appearing so close to us. Dylan, always the jokester, found it hilarious and suggested we message Jay, thinking it would be amusing to mess with him a bit. After some back and forth teasing, I reluctantly agreed. To our surprise, Jay responded enthusiastically, telling us he was around our age, 15 or 16, and lived nearby. When Dylan suggested we meet up at the park down the street, I initially thought it was just a joke, but Jay seemed eager to meet, saying he was free. It was a bright, sunny day, and there were four of us, so the idea of meeting up didn't feel too risky. We figured that if anything weird happened, we could just leave. Dylan casually told his mom we were heading to the park, and she nodded in approval. We walked to the park, excitement buzzing in the air. As we arrived, I decided to check the snap map again to see where Jay was. Sure enough, he was already at the park. I looked around, expecting to see a typical teenager, but instead, I spotted a man standing at the edge of the park, partially hidden behind some bushes. He looked older than I anticipated. As he stepped closer, I could see he was in his late 30s, maybe even older. As he approached our picnic table, a wave of unease washed over me. This wasn't the kid Jay had claimed to be. He looked nervous and unkempt, with scruffy hair and clothes that seemed out of style. We all felt the same discomfort, but nobody wanted to say anything. I tried to avoid eye contact, hoping he would just walk past us. When he got to our table, he stood there awkwardly, and we were too creeped out to acknowledge him. Then, to our horror, he took a step closer and almost sat down beside me. I looked up, my heart racing. He smiled and said, "Hey, are you Dylan?" At that moment, I knew for certain that this was Jay. He didn't look like a high school student at all. He was clearly much older. Dylan attempted to engage him in conversation, trying to mask the discomfort in the air. But the man stuttered and twitched nervously, making him appear even more unsettling. The situation felt wrong, and I could see my friends were just as ready to leave as I was. Finally, I managed to mumble something about needing to go. We all quickly stood up, eager to escape the awkwardness of the situation. Just as I turned away, I felt a strong grip on my arm. Two of my friends had already distanced themselves. But Dylan noticed and rushed over. He grabbed my other arm and pulled me away gently but firmly. I managed to break free before anything escalated, and we hastily walked away from the park. The man didn't follow us, but the unease lingered. We quickened our pace, confusion and fear mixing in our minds. When we finally reached Dylan's house, I felt a wave of relief. Still shaken, I immediately opened Snapchat and blocked Jay without hesitation. Later that night, as I settled into my room, which was on the ground floor and faced the backyard, I heard a soft tapping on my window. At first, I thought it was just a branch hitting against the glass. But then it happened again, and my heart dropped. I looked over and, to my horror, saw someone standing outside. It was Jay. I recognized him immediately, panic setting in. I bolted from my room, ran down the hall, and found my dad, frantically telling him someone was outside my window. By the time my dad got outside to check, Jay had already vanished. My dad called the police, but when they arrived, they told us there wasn't much they could do since Jay had disappeared without a trace. That night left me feeling shaken and vulnerable. Jay never contacted me again, and thankfully, I never saw him again after that night. The whole experience forced me to rethink my approach to online interactions. I had always been a little cautious, but now I realized how dangerous it could be to add strangers without knowing who they truly were. The incident became a cautionary tale for me and a lesson about the importance of online safety that I would carry with me for years to come. It was a reminder that the digital world can hold dangers that are all too real.